Hello students, we are back to our Biology 2 online course. This lecture will be about the circulatory system. What is the circulatory system or cardiovascular system? That's the same thing, synonyms. It's an organ system. You learned about organ systems already, right? It's an organ system that distributes blood to all parts of the body. The major function of the circulatory or cardiovascular system is transportation of the blood, using blood as the transport vehicle for substances that are needed by our cells, including gases, most of all oxygen, and also nutrients, and also some biologically active substances, hormones, etc. Now, I wrote at the bottom of this slide, note that the cardiovascular system is closed. It's a closed system in that the blood flows in closed circuits. There is no spilling of the blood anywhere in the body until William Harvey did his seminal experiments in the 17th century. The basic notion was that blood flows somehow from the liver and then spills into the abdominal cavity, and then it is collected from the abdominal cavity, moved to the heart, and then to the lungs and to the rest of the body. This is wrong, of course. Blood is circulating in two closed circuits. We will take a closer look at these two circuits, the pulmonary and the systemic circuit. Let me first read this caption, and you follow my reading using, tracking with your eyes how the blood flows. In this picture, there you see blood of two different kinds. One shown blue and the other is shown red. What's the difference? The blood shown in blue is poor in oxygen. Recall the gas exchange in the lungs and in the tissues. The blood that flows through the capillaries of the lung is poor in oxygen, right? That's why the oxygen from the air in alveoli diffuses into it, makes it richer with oxygen. Then the blood that is rich in oxygen flows to the tissues, to the entire body, actually. And again, recall the gas exchange. The blood that flows to the tissues is oxygen rich, right? And cells need oxygen, so they're poor in oxygen. There's a lower concentration of oxygen, so oxygen diffuses from the blood to the cells. Now let's see the flow, again, let's trace the flow of these two kinds of blood. Oxygen poor blood. To see the beginning of its flow, look at this heart in the center and see it's divided into two halves, one blue and one red. So the blue part, the blue half of the heart contains oxygen poor blood. It is left for you. But if you imagine that it's an individual who's standing facing you, it's his or her right? So we say right half of the heart has blood poor in oxygen. From this part of the heart, move your eyes a little bit up, following this blue stream. This oxygen poor blood flows to the lungs. There, in the lungs, recall there is this gas exchange in the alveoli, or from oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood. And look at now at the right part of the picture on top. From the lung, small blood vessels collect blood enriched in oxygen, and it returns to the heart being oxygen rich. This is the so-called pulmonary circuit, or smaller circuit of blood flow. from the right half of the heart to the lungs, then back to the left part of the heart. The blood begins to flow being oxygen poor, returns from the lungs to the left part of the heart being oxygen rich. Now let's trace the movement of the oxygen-rich blood. It's shown red. Now concentrate on the part of the heart which is colored red, and again, for you it's the right half, but for the individual who is standing and facing you, it's his or her left. Right? So we say from the left half of the heart. Now move your eyes as the red flow proceeds. The blood flows into some large blood vessel which forms a sort of like it bends down and carries oxygen-rich blood from the heart to tissues, to the entire body. See, the entire body is shown at the bottom of this figure. Then, again, like we discussed in the lecture about the gas exchange, in the tissues, this oxygen-rich blood gives up its oxygen and feeds oxygen to the tissues. So now move your eyes to the part of this bottom figure, to the part of the bottom part of this figure, which is on your left, and you see the blue-colored oxygen-poor blood continues to flow. Why is it oxygen-poor? Because it's just given up all its oxygen, or almost all of its oxygen, to the body. And note, where does it flow? It flows up and then back to the heart, but to what part of the heart? For this individual who is facing it, to the right part, right? And then again, from there, it flows up to the lungs, gets enriched with oxygen, returns back to the left part of the heart, left half, then it flows to the entire body, gives up its oxygen, becomes oxygen poor, and again returns to the right half of the heart. This larger circuit of blood flow, when it flows from the left half of the heart to the entire body, to all tissues of the body, and back to the right half of the heart, it's called systemic circuit. It's called systemic because it is supplying blood to all body systems. Right? The lungs are a separate story. In the lungs, there is this mechanism of enriching blood with oxygen, and it's the function of a separate circuit, this pulmonary circuit. And the function of the larger circuit, systemic circuit, is to feed tissues with the oxygen acquired in the lung. Okay? And the third bullet point, note that the right half of the heart on your left always has oxygen-poor blood. See, blue. The left half of the heart on your right always has oxygen-rich blood. And so I don't know, maybe you can invent some mnemonics for this, like right poor, left rich, something like this. Be creative about it. Then very important point here, it never mixes normally. See, the heart is strictly divided, we will see in the next slide, strictly divided by a hard membrane called septum into two halves. And what's to the right from this septum is always oxygen poor. What's to the left is always oxygen rich. There is you probably heard about it, there is a genetic defect. Unfortunately, it's not all that rare. It's called tetralogy of Fallot. It's when babies are born with holes in this septum. So the blood from the left half of the heart and the blood from the right half of the heart mix, forming blood which is not very rich in oxygen and not very poor in oxygen. And this really messes up the entire life of this little newborn baby, because uh, organs suffer from lack of oxygen, especially the brain suffers tremendously. And if these little babies are not operated, they should be surgically treated as soon as possible. Then they experience severe brain damage and usually do not survive even like more than several months. So remember about this wall of separation between the two halves of the heart. Now, a bit closer look at the heart's anatomy of the heart. See here, the heart is like cut, uh, and you see the section. What is this? It's frontal section, a frontal section of the heart. And again, you see two halves of it. And if you look at the bottom of this figure, there is a word septum. Now I found this word septum. And the arrow points at some sort of membrane that separates the left half of the heart, left for that individual that stands facing you, left half from the right half. Left half of the heart has cavity which is painted red, right? So it's oxygen, left, red, rich, right? And the right for this individual standing facing you, half of the heart also has a cavity which is painted what, blue, which means that it is oxygen, what, poor, right? So same thing as was shown on the previous slide. But there are some more anatomical details here. You see the septum is shown as a membrane. Uh, then the left half of the heart, uh, it's not very well shown here, but if you look at the very top of this uh, red painted half of the heart, which is right to you but left for this individual, uh, from the top there is some tube that goes behind this big blue tube, and you see it continues in between the two large blue tubes. This huge red tube, it's actually the first artery of the body called aorta. Look a bit higher, you will see the word aorta and the arrow pointing at this huge tube that carries blood from the left part of the heart. So it carries oxygen-rich blood from the left half of the heart to the body, to the tissues, to the organs, to the organ systems. Right. Then, if you now look at the uh, uh, you don't see the tissues here, but to your left from the aorta, you see there is also a blue tube which has relatively thin walls. And you see a sign here in Latin, vena cava. It means hollow vein. Now, when the blood flows through the aorta to the tissues, in the tissues it gives up its oxygen, it becomes oxygen poor, and then it is collected by a system of veins and brought back to the heart via veins. The last vein that completes this journey of blood from the periphery to back to the heart is called hollow vein or vena cava. Actually there are two of them. There is upper hollow vein or superior vena cava and lower hollow vein, inferior vena cava, shown at the bottom of the picture on your left. Right. Then on your left. Then the other half of the heart, the part on your left or the right part for this individual. If you look at the top of it, uh, you will see top closer to the middle. You will see something that is called pulmonary trunk. Right? It's the uh, actually it's the beginning of the pulmonary circuit. It's a huge blood vessel that carries blood, takes blood from the right portion of the heart and begins to push it to the lungs. And the lung in Latin is pulmonus, so the trunk is called pulmonary, and it branches into what we call pulmonary arteries. There are right pulmonary arteries and left pulmonary arteries. And these arteries bring blood, pour in oxygen to the lungs where there is gas exchange. Remember these pulmonary capillaries. And then the blood becomes oxygen rich and is returned to the heart, this time to the left part of the heart, by something that is called pulmonary veins. Find the caption, pulmonary veins. It so shows you left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins. Both sets of veins bring the oxygen-rich blood back to the heart, more specifically to the left part of the heart. So there's a trick, always just to never get confused. Begin from the beginning, and beginning from you is the left half of the heart. And from there, you know that there is always rich, oxygen-rich blood there. From there, the aorta carries it to the body systems. Then veins collect the blood, which is already poor in oxygen, and veins bring it back to the heart. This time, the blood goes into the left half of the heart, and from there, it goes into the pulmonary arteries, which bring it to the lungs, and lungs enrich it with oxygen, and then it flows back to the left portion of the heart. Not terribly difficult. If you just, I advise you to look carefully at this and maybe other pictures. There's a very good picture in your textbook, and just imagine the flow of blood. And also, I'm sure there are videos. If you search YouTube or other media and search for blood circulation or the work of the heart or pulmonary circuit, systemic circuit, you will always find some videos that show it in motion, show the blood, how the blood really flows. These slides are static, they don't show you movement, but I'm sure you can find videos that will facilitate your understanding of the story. Now, there is one other thing. We say right half of the heart, left half of the heart. In fact, it's a bit more complicated. Each half, the right half, the left half, the right half, which is poor in oxygen, carries blood, poor in oxygen, and the left half that contains blood rich in oxygen. Both of these cavities are separated into what we call two chambers. Right? You look at the right for this individual, or to your left half of the heart, you see there is something that says right atrium and points an arrow to some chamber. Right? Then this is the upper part of the right half of the heart. Then the lower part of the right half of the heart is called right ventricle. Same thing for the left half of the heart. The upper chamber, left atrium, the lower chamber, left ventricle. And note that left ventricle is the biggest chamber, right? It has a lot of space in there. And also the heart muscle, which is on the sides from this cavity, from this chamber, called left ventricle, is the thickest and the most powerful. And no wonder, because it's from the left ventricle that the blood during the contraction of the left ventricle flows into the left atrium and flows to the aorta, not to the atrium, flows to the aorta and two body systems. And then from if you look back to the right half, right for this individual, half of the heart, from the left ventricle, the blood flows to the pulmonary trunk and then to the pulmonary arteries. Right? So left ventricle is the beginning of which circuit? If it propels blood to the aorta and then to all body systems, systemic, right? And the right ventricle is the beginning of what circuit? If it propels blood to the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, pulmonary circuit, right? Then there are some, there are borders between the atria and ventricles. The word atrium, Latin, is singular. In plural, it's atria. Atria. So atria and ventricles are separated by special structures which are called valves. Valves. The valve makes sure that the blood does not flow from ventricles back to the atria. It flows from the atria to the ventricles. Oh, sorry, there is I will correct this. There is a mistake in the caption. It says from ventricles to atria. Actually, from atria to ventricles, and then from ventricles to large blood vessels. From left ventricle to aorta, from right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. I'm sorry, I will, if you have printouts of these slides, you can correct this, cross out that blood flows from ventricles to atria. That is not allowed. The valves close when ventricles contract. So the blood is moved to large arteries, not to the atria. When the blood flows back and atria contract, they propel blood to the ventricle, but from no blood flow from ventricles to atria. Okay, now a few words about blood vessels. We use these words atria, ventricles, and we use the word capillary. Remember, we said there are pulmonary capillaries, there are systemic capillaries in the tissues, and so let's just visualize what are these arteries, what are these veins, and what are these capillaries. An artery is shown at this picture on the right. It's dark red color. Note that it's a blood vessel which has thick walls. The wall of arteries consist of partially from smooth muscle tissue, so arteries can narrow and widen because of the work of these smooth muscles, and fibrous connective tissue. The bigger the artery, the less muscle it contains, and the more elastic fiber around it. Right. So large arteries like aorta or pulmonary artery, they have relatively stable volume. They do not widen or become narrow. They keep their lumen, their hollow part of the same volume, but they are elastic, means that they can stand very high pressure of the blood that is pumped from the ventricles of the heart, right, to the aorta, from the left ventricle to the pulmonary artery to the from the right ventricle. And arteries, this is the golden rule that you guys need to know. The arteries, we call arteries those blood vessels that carry blood from the heart. Veins, on the other hand, a vein is shown to the right. Veins are the opposite. They bring the blood back to the heart, either from the lungs or from the entire body. Right? Pulmonary veins bring blood back from the lungs, and hollow veins like upper hollow vein, lower hollow vein, bring blood from the rest of the body, from the peripheral tissue cells, etc. I want you guys to really understand this and remember this because people sometimes are confused. We sometimes use terms arterial blood and venous blood. If you look at veins, for example, on your hands or on your wrist, they are bluish and purplish. They're not red. And actually, it means that these are blood vessels that carry uh, oxygen poor blood, and people often call it a venous blood, blood from veins. And blood in arteries, God forbid if you see it, because bleeding from the artery is terribly difficult to stop. And the arteries have high pressure, etc. But the blood in the arteries is bright, bright scarlet red. And it is red, so red because it is rich in oxygen. So, and again, people call it arterial blood. But now, is it really correct? Actually not, because look at the pulmonary artery. It's an artery. It carries blood from the heart to the lungs. So it fits our definition of artery. Does it carry arterial blood? No. It carries oxygen poor blood, which normally we are used to the idea that it flows through veins. Then look at pulmonary veins that bring blood back to the uh, left atrium and then allowing it to flow to the left ventricle. Uh, it is oxygen rich, right? But the blood vessels that carry it are veins because, again, they fit our definition. They are blood vessels that bring the blood back to the heart. Okay, now aorta, we said it already, it's the first artery going directly from the heart, or more precisely from its left ventricle. Then aorta, imagine that this blood vessel is shown on the right. Imagine that it is aorta. It forms branches, numerous branches. One of the first branches of aorta is a branch that carries blood to the brain. Also, there are rather big branches that carry blood to the chest cavity and to the abdominal cavity. And each of these branches continues to branch. It's sort of like in the remember these bronchi in the lung. They keep bifurcating. Same thing with arteries and veins. They are all bifurcated. So aorta bifurcates, forming branches, and then these branches again form branches, and daughter branches again form branches, etc. At some point, these branching arteries become smaller, and finally your eye barely sees them, and then we call them arterioles, small arteries. We will return to this term arteriole when we learn something about how the kidneys function. Kidneys have some important arterioles. Then the continuing branches of arterioles, at some point they become microscopic, and now we call, instead of calling them arterioles, we call them capillaries. Capillary is a tiny microscopic blood vessel whose wall consists of just one layer of epithelial cells. There is no muscle and there is no fibrous or elastic cartilage. There's just one layer of epithelial cells. Then what happens there? In the capillaries of the systemic circuit, there is gas exchange. So the blood loses its oxygen, feeds oxygen to the tissues. And what then? Then this oxygen, now oxygen poor blood, is collected again into blood vessels that continue to merge. We started with branching, now we're talking about merging. Merge into small mergers called vanules, and then larger mergers, which we can also already see without any microscope. We call them veins. And the blood in veins flows strictly in the direction of the heart. In the systemic circuit, it's from the tissues of the body back to the heart, right? In the pulmonary circuit, it's from the lungs and again back to the heart. Okay. Uh, an interesting thing about capillaries, I mentioned Harvey, who was an English doctor, medical doctor, and also experimenter. He contributed a lot in human physiology, actually studied the um, circulatory system. He was the first to postulate that this the blood circulation is closed, so that there is no spilling of the blood in the abdominal cavity as ancients imagined. But there was this missing link. Harvey said, well, the arteries branch and branch and branch, and then they are collected into venules, then into veins, etc. And so there are these two circuits, pretty much everything like we say today. But there was this missing link. Harvey lived in the 17th century. Microscopy was not really developed back then. So he failed to see capillaries. He could imagine them in his head, but he couldn't show them to anyone because our eye does not see them. But then later in the 18th century, when microscopy became well developed, an Italian anatomist and physiologist, Marcello Malpighi, discovered capillaries physically. He saw capillaries. He saw these extensive networks of capillaries in the body, and he showed these capillaries, and that was a triumph. Actually, it proved that William Harvey was absolutely right, that the blood circulates into two closed circuits. It doesn't spill anywhere in the body, and all these Harvey's ideas were upheld. Okay. Now, the work of the heart. Actually, this slide is a very schematic representation of the work of the heart. We already, as we were speaking about the anatomy of the heart, atria, ventricles, septum, valves, etc., aorta, pulmonary arteries, etc., we already covered the work of the heart. But now, again, let us just trace what happens as the heart contracts. In the contraction of the heart, remember, there's always a sequence. Atria contract first, then they relax, then ventricles contract. When ventricles contract, atria are relaxed. When atria contract, ventricles are relaxed. Right. So let's just concentrate our eye on the left side of the heart. See, it's on the left in this picture. So it's like an individual is standing his or her back to you. So that person's left is also your left. Now, in this left side of the heart, there are atria and there are ventricles. The left atrium collects oxygen-rich blood from what veins? Pulmonary veins, right? So when the left atrium contracts, it pushes the blood into the left ventricle, right? Then the left ventricle contracts, but can it push the blood to the left atrium? No, because there is a valve, right? So where does the left ventricle push the blood? It says supply whole body through aorta, right? So the oxygenated blood came to the left atrium, then was pushed to the left ventricle, and then it went to the aorta. When the left ventricle contracted, the blood went to the aorta, and then it is supplied to the whole body through aorta. Then the upper part shows you an arrow pointing right, and imagine that this is the entire body. Right? That's where the gas exchange occurs. The blood feeds oxygen to the cells, the tissues, the organ system, becomes oxygen depleted. right? And it shows you oxygen depleted blood back to the heart. Now, where does it flow? The left ventricle is still tense. It has just contracted, so the flow of blood continues from aorta to all these branches, etc., to the capillaries, systemic capillaries, capillaries into tissues. And then the blood is collected into venules, right, and veins, and it flows back to the heart. And on the right part of this picture, you see it says right atrium. Right? So the right atrium uh, has what kind of blood? Oxygen rich or oxygen poor? Oxygen poor, right? Everything that is on the right is oxygen poor. And what veins bring this oxygen poor or oxygen depleted blood from the tissues to the right atrium? How do we call them? Hollow veins, or in Latin, superior and inferior vena cava, right? Hollow vein. Then it says from the right atrium it goes to right ventricle. When the right atrium contracts, at this moment right ventricle is relaxed. Right? The blood simply flows, the valve opens and the blood flows into the right ventricle. Then the atrium relaxes, and now it's the turn for the right ventricle to contract. Where does it, the right ventricle, where can it push blood? Not back to the right atrium, but it pushes it to the what to some large blood vessel. Which large blood vessel comes out from the right ventricle? How do we call it? Pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, right? And via the pulmonary arteries, which again branch, forming arterioles and capillaries, etc., the blood flows to the lung, and in the lung, as you remember, it becomes oxygen rich, and also it gets rid of carbon dioxide, which we exhale. And then it flows back to the heart, right, to the heart. Now it goes to the left atrium through what blood vessels? We mentioned them at the beginning, through the pulmonary veins. And again, this we are very compressed in time. I'm very compressed in time. You guys are very compressed in time. So we are just sort of making major points. And if you want to really, really understand it, first read your textbook slowly and make sure that you understand this system. Where does the blood go from where? I really recommend you to search YouTube or other media, other software for videos that detail these movements of the heart and of the blood. Okay, now let us take a look at the heart as far as the coronary arteries are concerned. What are coronary arteries? They are arteries which are branches of aorta. By the way, they stem from the aorta, so they are oxygen rich, and they branch actually, and their arterioles and capillaries feed oxygen to the heart muscle. The heart is a muscular organ. The heart muscle contracts all the time, and it needs oxygen to contract a muscle. Absolutely. Remember, we mentioned it when we covered metabolism, and we mentioned white muscle fibers, which work on, or live and work mostly on glycolysis, right? And red meat or slow muscle fibers, which absolutely require oxygen because they cannot survive on glycolysis. They do not store glycogen. So the heart is like the ultimate example of the slow muscle fiber, or red meat. It's the reddest of all meats, the heart. So it dies if it doesn't get enough oxygen. It cannot subsist on glycolysis. It doesn't store glycogen, and it will not have readily available glucoses to throw them into this furnace of glycolysis. So it does need aerobic respiration, and for that it needs oxygen. And the right part of this picture shows you an artery, and you see there is something wrong in this artery. What does this yellowish, whitish thing at the bottom of the picture? It's called atherosclerotic plaque, right? The plaques form because of two reasons. First, because walls of arteries can inflame, and second, because when people do not eat healthy, their spectrum of fats or lipids in the blood is abnormal, and this favors the buildup of these plaques. The plaques narrow the arteries, and it can happen to any artery, and it unfortunately rather often happens to coronary arteries. If coronary arteries are, we say, occluded, and they're artificially narrowed because there's this growing atherosclerotic plaque in it, then the heart muscle simply does not receive enough blood, and it means that it does not receive enough oxygen, and it dies, and it all can be exacerbated, exaggerated by a forming blood clot. Really, growing plaques favor forming of blood clots. Then the a coronary artery can be completely closed, and this is really dangerous. This can lead to the death of a substantial part of the heart muscle within hours. In 24 hours, like a major area of the heart can be dead, and this is what we call severe heart attack or myocardial infarction. So that's coronary arteries. Please remember about them. Now, there's one interesting thing about heart. It has a conduction system. What does it mean? Back in the 19th century, there was a German scientist called Ludwig, and he was very interested in what nerves contact cells of the heart muscle and make them contract. And to find this out, he took the heart of the frog and cut it into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, placed each piece in a solution which contained various salts, importantly calcium. Calcium was very important for this. And he watched that these pieces of heart continued to contract outside of the organism. And there were no nerves that contacted them. So these cells of the heart muscle did not receive any signals from the frog's brain or from the frog's spinal cord, and yet they continued to contract. So Ludwig was the first to suggest that there is some conduction system within the heart, and it turned out to be true. See, on the left, on your left, the top part of the left, on your left from your point of view, part of this heart, or its right half of the heart if the individual is standing facing you, right? So it's that individual's right half, and the upper part of this individual's right half is right atrium, and you see there is this bright golden colored spot in the right atrium. It's called sinoatrial node. Sometimes it's called sinus node, but I prefer my own school is the sinoatrial node. It's an agglomerate of special cells. They are still cardiac heart muscle cells, but they have special properties. They are the natural pacemakers. So they establish the rhythm, the pace of contraction. Then from the sinoatrial node, there are connections that link it with another node called arterioventricular node. Then from the atrioventricular node, there are further connections. All of them, all these golden colored threads, they're formed by these special pacemaker heart muscle cells. And they, these pathways kind of branch again, and eventually they are lost in the thickness of the heart muscle. That's the conduction system of the heart. So normally the heart rhythm is established in the sinoatrial node and then conducted to other areas of the heart. And remember, in the heart is an interesting organ. Heart muscle it consists of individual cells, but each of these cells is connected with another cell. There are special gaps, and that they allow mixing of liquids actually between different heart muscle cells. So if some chemical content changes in one cell somewhere close to the sinoatrial node, then it gradually changes in heart muscle cells that are further and further and further away from the original cell that changed its chemical content. Right? And actually the contraction of the heart pretty much depends on this chemical content, and shifts in the chemical content, they lead to the contraction of first atria and then the ventricles. And so that's normal conduction system. And if some of you, there are no pre-nursing majors in this class, but you guys there are exercise, kinesiology majors, so probably you will have to do, you were dealing with human subjects, patients, and you will measure their pulse, and when a health professional measures the pulse, the first question is even not how many contractions per minute, which is important, but even before that, you ask yourself, is this pulse rhythmical or is it chaotic? Right? And if it is rhythmical, odds are that it is dictated or is by the sinoatrial node. So we say sinus rhythm, normal sinus rhythm. That's the sign of the healthy conduction system of the heart. Now, very important concept, guys. Whether you are a doctor or a nurse or an engineer or a musician or a lawyer, doesn't matter. You need to know something about the blood pressure. Strictly, from the point of view of physics, blood pressure means how strong is the pressure of the blood on the walls of the blood vessels. But when blood pressure is measured, it is measured on the shoulder artery, and the person who does this measurement fixes his or her attention on two parameters. One is called upper blood pressure, or another word is systolic blood pressure. It is the pressure of the blood in the shoulder artery exerted on the walls of the shoulder artery at the moment when the heart contracts, right? More precisely, when the two ventricles contract, the left and the right ventricles contract. This phenomenon of contraction of the heart in medicine since ancient times is marked by an ancient Greek term, systole. So it's the systolic blood pressure or upper blood pressure. And then there's another parameter that also specialists know how to establish it or visualize and visually fix it. It's the so-called lower or diastolic pressure. It's the pressure measured when the heart is relaxed. So again, it's about the interaction of the blood with the walls of the shoulder artery and maybe other arteries. But it's measured when the blood is not pumped by the contractions of the heart. And so you may ask why there is any pressure at all when the heart is relaxed and not pumping blood. There should be zero pressure. No, actually no, because when the blood flows, there is inertia. When after some like about second or maybe a second and a half, 2 seconds after the systole, when the heart is relaxing, the blood continues to flow simply because of inertia. And now the pressure that we are measuring is the pressure created by the blood vessels resisting the flow of blood. Right? So systolic blood pressure tells you how heart is working, how hard the ventricles are pushing the blood to the periphery. And the diastolic or the lower blood pressure tells you about the blood vessels, how the blood vessels resist the flow of blood. So it may be substantial, especially when, again, when arteries are narrowed by something. Like, remember this previous slide, that 2 slides back, that showed you atherosclerotic plaque in the coronary artery. It narrowed the artery. When arteries are narrowed, the resistance to the flow of blood is higher, so the diastolic pressure will be higher. Now, there are two numbers that I recommend you guys to memorize. And we are always told, we teachers are always told that you don't make, don't emphasize on memorization. Teach your students to think, which is actually correct, but still in medicine and in public health, there are some numbers that any person should know by heart. You don't have time sometimes to look at the reference literature. It helps if you simply know what are the normal levels of the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. The systolic blood pressure should not exceed 120 milliliters of the mercury rise in a standard glass column. The original apparatus for measuring blood pressure was a glass column which had a little piece of mercury, and it was connected with the shoulder arteries through this sleeve, manchette in French. And the higher is the blood pressure, the higher the mercury rises in this standard glass column. So this, it's a very, something like 200 years old way of measuring blood pressure, but it is still used. It's still true. There are many, of course, there are more modern apparatuses that measure blood pressure in split second, etc. But this is the traditional one. And so the numbers of blood pressure, usually they are numbers of millimeters of the mercury rise. In apparatuses that do not have mercury and glass column, they have some inbuilt facilities that convert the data from the actually received during the measurement of the blood pressure into these millimeters of mercury. So 120 millimeters. In recent years, actually, the trend is to lower it even to 119. Doctors frown at those who say that, well, okay, normal blood pressure is 120 and I have 135. What's the big deal? And actually, it is a big deal. The blood pressure should not exceed 120 millimeters. Better even, it should not exceed 119. And the current notion of the American Association of Cardiologists is that it doesn't depend on the age of the person. Back in my days, I went to Kyiv Medical University in Ukraine in the late 70s and early 80s, and we were taught that the formula for systolic blood pressure is 100 plus your age. So for a 40-year-old person, it's okay if he or she has the systolic blood pressure of 140. For a 50-year-old, it's okay to have 150. Now it's dismissed. Modern studies show that it is not healthy for a person of any age to have systolic blood pressure exceeding 120 millimeters. And the diastolic blood pressure, there's also a limit. It should not exceed 80 millimeters, or the most recent recommendations are that it shouldn't even exceed 79 millimeters. Please know your blood pressure. Be aware of what blood pressure you have. And the rule of thumb is at some point, if it is higher than 120, but systolic higher than 120, but lower than 140, you can try at least to fix it by simply living a healthier life. Eat healthier, exercise, have a lot of fresh air, conquer your stress, your anxieties, etc. But if it is 140 and higher, you need medication. You need blood pressure therapy. Currently, again, it's the old notion was that the ultimate reason of high blood pressure is stress. But now we say, well, yes, stress helps to increase blood pressure, but the primary reason is actually something that goes on in the adrenal glands and in the kidneys. This axis between adrenal gland and kidney, it can become axis of evil. In many of us, unfortunately, it does, and the kidney produces too much of a certain hormone which increases the volume of the circulating blood, and this leads to increase in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. But of course, the stress also matters, the body weight also matters, etc. The diet also matters. Now, what can go wrong with the heart? The heart attack. Right? We know it's number one killer, actually, of Americans and worldwide. At least in the third world countries, it may be infectious diseases or helminth infestations, but in the industrially developed part of the world where the hygiene standards are high, where there is vaccination against infections, right, where there is a sanitary control so that we don't ingest eggs of helminths all the time, but so seemingly healthy as we all are at risk of heart attack, and many of us are under very severe risk of heart attack, and it's the number one killer of people in the United States. What is heart attack? It is when the heart muscle lacks oxygen, and there are two major reasons which may be combined. One is narrowing of the coronary artery by atherosclerosis, and the other is narrowing of or occluding meaning totally like putting a stopper into a coronary artery because of the blood clotting, forming of the blood clot. And these two reasons may be combined, and that's the worst case scenario, when a person has atherosclerosis and tendency to form clots in blood vessels, especially in coronary arteries. And again, remember, we emphasized it several times that the heart muscle absolutely needs oxygen. It cannot subsist on glycolysis. It needs the regular supply of arterial blood, high in oxygen blood from the systemic circuit, from the branches of aorta. If it is not supplied with blood for an hour, for 2, 3 hours, it's already bad. right, manifests as angina, right, or chest pain. If it is not supplied by enough oxygen for 10, 15, 20, 24 hours, that's the end of this muscle. So the area that is not supplied with arterial blood simply dies. We say undergoes necrosis. It's irreversible dying of the muscle cells. And you see there is in this picture at the apex of the heart. It's the bottom part of the drawing of the heart. There is a dark area, like a triangle that, and it says dying muscle. That's where the necrosis occurs. And of course, the larger is this area, the weaker the heart becomes. If it is really, if like bigger part of the heart muscle is dying, necrotized, then the blood simply cannot be pumped into the aorta and into the pulmonary artery, and it creates the accumulation of extra blood in the periphery, and especially in the lungs. And in the lungs, the lung capillaries are very fragile. They cannot resist extra pressure. They begin to lose liquid portion of the blood. So the blood plasma, basically water, flows into the alveoli. And what we have is the result. It's called lung edema, and it's a lethal condition. If it's not immediately taken care of, it will result in death. Now, you probably know the basic symptoms of a heart attack: chest pain, right? Almost never in the area where the heart is. You know, you all can point at your heart. It's to the left from the chest bone, sternal bone, right? And it's below the nipple and above the diaphragm. That's really the area where the heart is, but the pain is usually not there. It may be in the center, like this person holds his left hand on the center of his chest. In some people, the pain is in the upper left part of the chest, in the area of the clavicle, in the left part of the neck, in the left jaw. It's called irradiating pain, and it may be very strong. So the person must be given strong painkillers. Then the person must be given blood thinners. Why? Because again, the worst case scenario is when the coronary artery is occluded by both atherosclerotic plaque and a blood clot. So to prevent, even if the blood clotting has already occurred, it needs to be stopped. And for that reason, blood thinners are given. Aspirin, nowadays every ambulance vehicle has a stock of aspirin, because people with chest pain, they're just fed aspirin whether they want it or not. It's just to be on the safe side. And then when they are already in the hospital, what may help temporarily, not really radically, mechanical inflation of coronary arteries, angioplasty, when a balloon is inserted into the coronary artery and inflated so that the blood can flow through these area and prevent further necrosis of the blood tissue, of the heart muscle. Or coronary bypass. It's a surgical operation when surgeons restitch coronary arteries so that they carry blood without obstacle, kind of bypassing this area where there is occlusion. It's a pretty difficult surgical procedure. Not every doctor can do it, so you can imagine that living somewhere far from hospitals, having heart attack may be really, really bad. So the best thing is to prevent heart attacks by, first and foremost, preventing the forming of the atherosclerotic plaques, eating healthy, exercising, taking care of stress, liquidating stress. Now, a bit more about blood pressure. You see, like I said, the primary reason for high blood pressure is in the adrenal glands and in the kidney. But still, we all know there's a huge statistics has been gathered that says that if you have extra weight, especially if your body mass index is 32 or higher, or in other words, if you are obese, you are at very high risk of high blood pressure. If you smoke, you are at a bigger risk of high blood pressure compared to people who do not smoke. If you do not exercise, never exercise, uh, sometimes people who are in their 30s, even early 40s, they say, why should I don't have time to exercise. I'm not really overweight. And look at me, I'm so healthy. I don't really need anything. It's for those people who are overweight, who are old, they should go to or young people who want to pump their muscles, to look good. I don't need that. No, you actually need to exercise always, because the sedentary lifestyle, when you spend all your days sitting and all your nights lying on the couch watching TV, that's very bad. It increases the risk of becoming obese, and it increases the risk of atherosclerosis and of high blood pressure, etc. Uh, okay, and finally, the last slide in this lecture, cardiac arrhythmia. You probably heard about people who have arrhythmias, especially atrial fibrillation. It's so common that most people heard about it. I will reveal you a secret. I have it, although right now it's under control, it's compensated, but I started to develop atrial fibrillation in approximately 2009, between 2009 and 2010. Back then I was exercising pretty regularly, and I noticed one strange thing. When you are running on treadmill, there is a dial which shows you your pulse before you run and after you run. And I noticed some real strange thing with the dial. Before I ran, showed 95, 100 heartbeats per minute. It's pretty fast heart rate. Before I never had it. And then I would run for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, etc., lose some calories, and look at the dial, and the dial shows 65 heartbeats per minute. That's crazy. That cannot happen, right? When you are strenuously exercising physically, when you strain your muscles, your heartbeat always becomes faster. But the thing is that when you have AFib, when you have atrial fibrillation, the machine cannot really accurately count your heartbeats, because your heartbeat is chaotic. It's not like this. It's rather like this. And this is atrial fibrillation. Why it happens? Normally, the heart has a natural pacemaker. It's a collection of special heart muscle cells which are aggregated at the recall this slide, we actually showed it. They are aggregated at the top of the right atrium. This collection of pacemaker cells is called sinoatrial node, or on this slide, sinus node. Right? And this is the spot that actually establishes the normal rhythm. And then it is conducted to other nodes and to the rest of the heart. Now, on the right part of this picture, you see there is the sinoatrial node, and there are numerous bright red spots, like stars. What they are actually extra pacemakers. They are abnormal. They're unneeded. And the thing is that they do not work in sync with the sinoatrial node. They work on their own. So the pace becomes irregular, chaotic. Some people are lucky, actually. Atrial fibrillation by itself, it does not harm you. There are people who live for years and years that they don't even notice that they have AFib, but they have it. And if they're not very lucky, complications might develop. The chaotic heart rhythm leads to disturbances of the blood flow, and that predisposes people uh, for forming of blood clots. And this is terrible because these blood clots may form in some artery and then get torn by the blood flow, travel somewhere and relocate. And they can relocate in the brain and then you have stroke, or they can relocate in the say pulmonary artery and you have pulmonary embolism. And I actually I had a bilateral pulmonary embolism in January 2012, and it was terrible. I mean, the pain was huge, and somebody told me that most certainly you do not know what is the pain during natural childbirth, being a male. But this pain during bilateral pulmonary embolism is like second most severe pain after childbirth. And I, we called ambulance, and I was delivered to the IC unit, and I spent about a week in under special care, and I was given a lot of heparin intravenously. Heparin dissolves blood clots and prevents further forming of the blood. It was really bad. And interesting thing, guys, you tell the story to your friends that you have a unique instructor. In what way? Because there is statistics about unilateral pulmonary embolism, and it says that in the case of one-sided pulmonary embolism, the mortality is 21%. So basically every fifth person who has one-sided pulmonary artery embolism dies, right? And there is no such statistics for bilateral pulmonary embolism. It's considered 100% lethal, right? So the statistics was not even gathered. It's thought that if you have it, you die. And I'm still alive. I'm not a ghost. I'm a real person. You don't really. You're not sure because you don't see me. You cannot shake my hand, etc. But I assure you that I'm alive. You can meet me and shake my hand and everything. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Please, I am very sorry for that little mistake in the caption to the one of the slides where it said that blood flows from the ventricle to the atrium. That's not correct. Blood flows from atrium to ventricle and from ventricle to a large artery, never back to the atrium. I will correct that. And you guys stay healthy, stay healthy and stress resistant. Study like crazy, but everything in kind of moderation. So take some breaks. I know that the closer to the end of the semester, the crazier it will be, but you will survive. I'm sure you will do well. Okay, until the next time.